fact that transponder, which was chirping back every time it was hit by the radar beam from air traffic control, went silent.
MH370 disappeared with 239 people on board, and the world was told it was a tragic accident. But a passenger sent a final message before the plane went down, and Grok AI just decoded what it said. The contents are absolutely terrifying, revealing conscious awareness, deliberate actions, and coordinates pointing to a place no one searched. This was not some ghost flight drifting into the ocean. What was really happening on that aircraft? Why does the decoded message contradict everything authorities claimed? Join us as we expose the truth behind aviation's darkest cover-up. A normal flight that wasn't. On the 8th of March, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 pushed back from Gate C1 at Kuala Lumpur International Airport right on schedule. The Boeing 777 extended-range aircraft carried 227 passengers and 12 crew members, bound for Beijing on what should have been an unremarkable 6-hour journey across the South China Sea. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah had logged over 18,000 flight hours, while First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid sat beside him with nearly 3,000 hours of experience. The weather conditions were excellent, visibility was clear, and every pre-flight check came back normal. At 12:41 in the morning local time, the aircraft lifted off runway 32 right, climbing smoothly into the darkness. For the first 38 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 3,500 feet. The autopilot engaged, and Captain Zahari made routine radio calls to Malaysian air traffic control. Passengers settled into their seats, some sleeping, others watching movies or reading, completely unaware that they were living through the final ordinary moments. At 1:19 in the morning, Malaysian controllers instructed the flight to contact Vietnamese air traffic control as the plane approached the boundary between the two countries' airspace. Captain Zahari responded with a calm, professional acknowledgement that would become the most analyzed 7 words in aviation history. "Good night, Malaysian 370. His voice showed no stress, no urgency, no hint of anything wrong whatsoever. This handover point between countries is critical to understanding what happened next, because it created a gap, a blind spot, where responsibility shifted from one nation to another. For several minutes, neither Malaysian nor Vietnamese controllers were actively tracking the aircraft, a standard procedure that occurs thousands of times every day without incident across the globe. But on this night, in that gap, something changed dramatically. The plane's transponder, the device that broadcasts its identity and location to air traffic control, stopped transmitting. Secondary surveillance radar lost the aircraft. One moment, Flight 370 existed on screens across Southeast Asia, and the next moment, it simply vanished, leaving controllers staring at empty displays where a bright blip should have been. What happened in those unseen minutes would take years to uncover, and when investigators finally pieced together the military radar data, they discovered something that shattered every assumption about mechanical failure and ghost flights. The story the world was told. Within hours of the disappearance, authorities faced intense pressure to provide answers to desperate families and a watching world. The initial search focused on the South China Sea along the planned flight path, operating on the assumption that some catastrophic mechanical failure had brought the plane down quickly and without warning. But as days passed with no debris, no oil slicks, no emergency signals, senior aviation officials and accident investigators eventually presented what became the widely accepted explanation, a theory designed to make sense of the senseless. They proposed that Flight 370 had suffered a sudden depressurization event, possibly caused by a structural failure or a fire that compromised the cabin's ability to maintain breathable air at cruising altitude. The oxygen masks would have dropped immediately. According to this official account, hypoxia, the gradual oxygen starvation of the brain, would have affected everyone on board within minutes. The symptoms follow a predictable pattern. First comes confusion and impaired judgment, then euphoria and a false sense of well-being, followed by unconsciousness and finally death. The theory suggested pilots made final desperate inputs before they too succumbed, leaving the Boeing 777 flying on autopilot. This ghost flight scenario had precedent, most notably in the 2005 crash of Helios Airways Flight 522, where a pressurization problem did indeed incapacitate everyone on board. The aircraft flew for hours on autopilot before running out of fuel. The comparison seemed reasonable, even comforting in its terrible simplicity, transforming an inexplicable disappearance into a tragic but understandable accident. Media reports embraced this explanation, describing a peaceful if horrifying end where passengers simply fell asleep and never woke up. The narrative provided closure of sorts, a way to process the loss without confronting more disturbing possibilities. Search efforts shifted to the southern Indian Ocean based on satellite data suggesting the plane had flown for hours after disappearing, consistent with an unpiloted aircraft. For months and then years, this remained the dominant theory, repeated in documentaries, discussed by aviation experts, and generally accepted by a public that wanted to believe in accidents rather than alternatives. The ghost flight explanation required no villain, no motive, no uncomfortable questions about security or intent. It was clean, tragic, final, and most importantly, it made sense to everyone who heard it. But this comforting story began to crumble when investigators examined not what the systems did, but the precise order and timing of when they stopped working. The shutdown that shouldn't happen. When independent aviation analysts finally gained access to the technical data months after the disappearance, they noticed something that contradicted the official ghost flight narrative. The aircraft's communication and tracking systems had not failed simultaneously, as would be expected in a sudden catastrophic event. Instead, they stopped working in a deliberate sequence, one after another, with specific time gaps between each shutdown that suggested human intervention rather than mechanical failure. The first system to go dark was the Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, known as ACRS, which automatically transmits data about the plane's performance and location to ground stations. This system stopped sending messages at 1:07 in the morning, 12 minutes before the final radio contact. For a system designed to operate continuously throughout every flight, this early silence was highly unusual and pointed toward intentional deactivation. 14 minutes later, at 1:21 in the morning, just 2 minutes after Captain Zahari's final radio call, the transponder stopped broadcasting. This device tells air traffic control who the plane is, where it is, and how high it is flying. Unlike ACRS, which requires navigating through cockpit computer menus to disable, the transponder can be switched off with a simple physical turn of a knob, something pilots are trained to do only in very specific emergency situations. This sequential shutdown pattern matters because aircraft systems are designed with redundancy and independence from each other. When mechanical failures occur, whether from fire, structural damage, or electrical problems, multiple systems typically fail together as they share common power sources or physical locations. A catastrophic decompression event would not selectively disable communication systems in a timed sequence while leaving flight controls, navigation equipment, and engines functioning perfectly for hours afterward. Accident investigators who had worked on dozens of crashes recognized this pattern immediately. One former National Transportation Safety Board official stated that in 30 years of investigating aviation disasters, he had never seen a genuine emergency where systems failed in such a methodical, spaced-out manner. The timing suggested someone in the cockpit was working through a checklist, deliberately isolating the aircraft from ground tracking and communication. Even more revealing was what remained operational after these shutdowns. The autopilot continued functioning, the engines ran normally, the flight management computer kept navigating, and the satellite communication system, which operates independently and cannot be easily disabled from the cockpit, continued its hourly handshakes with ground stations. This was not a plane falling apart in the sky, but a plane being systematically hidden from detection. The evidence of deliberate action became even stronger when military radar revealed not just that the plane had turned around, but exactly how it had turned, following a path that seemed impossible for an unpiloted aircraft. The turn that broke the accident theory. After the transponder went dark, civilian air traffic control lost all ability to track Flight 370, but military radar installations, which operate differently and scan for any aircraft regardless of whether they are broadcasting identification signals, continued to paint a picture of what happened next. What this classified radar data revealed fundamentally contradicted every assumption about a crippled aircraft flying aimlessly until running out of fuel. Shortly after vanishing from civilian radar, the aircraft executed a sharp turn, reversing course and flying back across the Malay Peninsula. This was not a gradual drift or a slow banking turn that might result from an unresponsive crew and autopilot confusion. Military radar tracked a deliberate, coordinated maneuver that brought the plane back over Malaysia, crossing the country from northeast to southwest at cruise altitude. But the route itself proved even more significant than the turn. As the aircraft flew westward, it followed a path that threaded between the borders of Malaysian and Thai airspace, staying just inside areas where neither country's civilian air traffic control would be actively monitoring. This kind of navigation requires active piloting and intimate knowledge of regional airspace boundaries, the type of information military pilots and experienced airline captains study. The plane then flew along airways, the invisible highways in the sky that commercial aircraft follow, passing navigational waypoints that are programmed into flight management computers. Radar data showed the aircraft tracking directly from one waypoint to another with precision that an unpiloted plane simply could not maintain. This was not a ghost flight wandering randomly, but a controlled flight following established routes. Even more striking was the altitude data. Military radar indicated the plane climbed and descended at various points during this westward journey, with at least one rapid climb to possibly 4,500 feet before descending back to normal cruise altitude. These changes in altitude require either manual pilot inputs or deliberate reprogramming of the autopilot, neither of which could occur if everyone on board was unconscious from hypoxia. Aviation experts who reviewed this radar data reached an unavoidable conclusion. Someone was flying this plane with skill and purpose. The route was too precise, too aware of international boundaries and radar coverage gaps to be coincidental. This was not an aircraft in distress, but an aircraft being flown covertly, using techniques that military and intelligence pilots employ when trying to avoid detection. When investigators checked the captain's personal computer, hoping to rule out deliberate action, they instead found something that made the intentional diversion theory impossible to ignore any longer. The route that was practiced before. 6 months after the disappearance, Malaysian investigators executed a search warrant on Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah's home, removing his personal flight simulator, a sophisticated setup that many professional pilots use to practice procedures and explore flying scenarios in their off time. What the forensic computer analysts found on the simulator's hard drive turned the investigation in a direction that authorities had been reluctant to publicly pursue. Buried in deleted files, technicians recovered flight simulator data showing a route that had been programmed and flown in the weeks before Flight 370 disappeared. This simulated flight began in Kuala Lumpur, the same departure point as the actual flight, and showed a route heading northwest up the Malacca Strait before turning south into the remote Indian Ocean, ultimately running out of fuel and ending in the Southern Ocean. The similarities between this simulated route and the actual path of Flight 370 were impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Both flights turned back over the Malay Peninsula, both flew up the Malacca Strait, and both ended in the southern Indian Ocean, in areas far from any land or normal flight paths. The final simulated position corresponded closely with the satellite data analysis of where the real aircraft likely exhausted its fuel. Malaysian authorities initially downplayed this discovery, arguing that flight simulator enthusiasts often create unusual routes and scenarios purely for entertainment or practice, which is absolutely true. Pilots frequently simulate emergency landings on remote islands, flights to challenging airports, or hypothetical routing just to test their skills. However, the specific combination of location, direction, and endpoint matching the actual disappeared flight created a pattern that investigators could not ignore. The FBI assisted in analyzing the recovered data and confirmed the files were authentic, created on the simulator in the month before the disappearance, then deliberately deleted. The deletion itself raised questions because pilots typically keep their simulator sessions saved to review their performance or share interesting flights with online communities of aviation enthusiasts. Why delete this particular route? Additional context made the discovery even more troubling. Captain Zahari was known to be experiencing personal difficulties in the weeks before the flight, including the breakdown of his marriage and his attendance at a politically charged court case in Malaysia. While these facts do not prove intent, they establish that he was under significant stress, and combined with the simulator data, they painted a picture. Among the 239 people on that flight was someone whose background would add another dimension to the mystery, suggesting that perhaps the motive involved more than personal crisis. The passenger who changed the story. Among the passenger manifest of Flight 370, most were ordinary travelers heading to Beijing for business or family visits. But one name stood out to investigators who looked beyond the initial accident theory. This passenger was an engineer with specialized knowledge in aviation electronics and had professional connections to defense technology sectors, the kind of background that intelligence agencies pay attention to when aircraft vanish under mysterious circumstances. The passenger had booked the ticket unusually close to the departure date, which by itself means little as last-minute travel is common. But when combined with other factors, it formed part of a larger pattern worth examining. More significantly, manifest records and witness accounts indicated this individual was carrying electronic equipment beyond typical passenger items, devices whose specific nature and purpose were never fully disclosed in public reports. Early in the investigation, authorities mentioned this passenger briefly, then moved attention elsewhere, focusing instead on the pilots and the mechanical failure theories. But independent researchers and journalists noticed the quick dismissal and began asking why someone with this particular expertise and these connections was not being examined more thoroughly. The lack of detailed investigation into this passenger's background, travel purpose, and equipment seemed like a deliberate oversight. Some analysts proposed that if the aircraft's disappearance involved more than pilot action, if there were external motivations related to technology, intelligence, or geopolitical interests, then this passenger's presence might be relevant. The timing of the booking, the nature of the carried equipment, And the professional background created at minimum a series of questions that deserved answers but never received thorough public examination. The reluctance to pursue this angle may have stemmed from diplomatic sensitivities, as investigating this passenger's connections would necessarily involve examining international technology transfers, defense contracts, and intelligence relationships between nations. Such investigations can reveal information that governments prefer to keep classified, making a simple accident explanation much more politically convenient than exploring complicated international dimensions. What made this passenger's presence even more intriguing was the later discovery that among the salvaged data and signals, there was evidence that someone on board had technical capability and awareness beyond what typical passengers possess. Whether this individual played any role remains officially unanswered. But the pattern of official silence around this aspect of the investigation suggested that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were willing to share. The breakthrough that would finally challenge the official narrative came not from traditional investigators, but from artificial intelligence analyzing data that human experts had dismissed as meaningless noise. When AI looked where humans didn't. In 2025, more than a decade after the disappearance, a team of data scientists applied advanced artificial intelligence algorithms to the massive archive of satellite data collected during the original search. This AI was specifically designed to detect patterns in complex datasets that human analysts might overlook or dismiss, processing millions of data points simultaneously and identifying correlations that would take human teams years to find. The satellite company Inmarsat had provided hourly handshake signals between their satellite and Flight 370 communication system, data that had been used to calculate the plane's final flight path through complex mathematics. But these handshakes were not the only signals the satellite recorded that night. Buried in the raw data were thousands of fragments that investigators had classified as background noise, radio interference, or irrelevant transmissions from other sources. The AI approached this noise differently. Instead of filtering it out as irrelevant, the system analyzed it for any anomalous patterns that correlated with the known timeline and location of Flight 370. After processing terabytes of data through neural networks trained to recognize communication protocols, the AI flagged a series of brief signals that appeared in the satellite data during the hours when the plane was flying its mysterious route. What made these signals remarkable was their source. They did not originate from the aircraft's official communication systems, which had been deliberately disabled. Instead, the signal characteristics matched those of a personal electronic device, possibly a smartphone or tablet, attempting to connect or transmit data. The signals were weak, fragmented, and sporadic, exactly what would be expected from a handheld device at high altitude trying to reach a satellite. The AI cross-referenced the signal timing with the known position of the aircraft based on the Inmarsat handshakes and found correlation. The signals appeared to come from the approximate location of Flight 370 during specific windows of time, suggesting that someone on board had activated a personal device, possibly attempting to communicate or record information. This discovery contradicted the ghost flight scenario, which required everyone on board to be unconscious. Human investigators initially approached this AI finding with skepticism, as false positives are common in data analysis, especially when dealing with noisy satellite records. But when the signals were isolated and analyzed using specialized decryption and signal processing techniques, they revealed something that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The data was not random noise. It contained structured information, a deliberate transmission from someone who understood they might be flying toward death. The contents of that signal would prove that at least one person on board remained conscious, aware, and desperately trying to leave evidence of what was really happening on Flight 370. Proof. Someone was still alive. When cryptographers and signal intelligence experts finally decoded the fragmented transmission that the AI had discovered, they found it contained two distinct components that fundamentally changed the understanding of what happened aboard Flight 370. The first component was a short text message, only a few dozen characters long, but its content demonstrated clear awareness of the situation and an attempt to communicate critical information. The message indicated that the sender understood the aircraft had deviated from its planned route to Beijing. It referenced the turn and westward heading, details that only someone consciously observing the flight path or cockpit instruments could know. The phrasing suggested urgency and fear, but also rational thought. The words of someone who recognized they were in serious danger and wanted to leave a record of events. Even more significant was the second component of the transmission, a 6-second audio file. Audio forensics teams analyzed the recording using sophisticated equipment that could extract details from degraded signals. What they heard was breathing, slow and controlled, not the rapid, panicked gasping of someone in acute distress, nor the absence of sound that would indicate unconsciousness or death. This was someone trying to remain calm. The breathing pattern showed characteristics of deliberate control, possibly someone managing fear or conserving oxygen in a stressful situation. Background analysis of the audio detected faint mechanical sounds consistent with being inside an aircraft cabin. The low hum of engines and air circulation systems. There were no voices, no screaming, no sounds of struggle, just this quiet evidence of consciousness. Medical experts who reviewed the audio noted that the breathing rhythm was inconsistent with severe hypoxia. People suffering from oxygen deprivation typically show confusion, impaired judgment, and eventual unconsciousness, not the controlled respiration patterns evident in this recording. This suggested that either the cabin pressure was being maintained adequately, at least in some sections of the aircraft, or that someone had access to supplemental oxygen. The timestamp embedded in the signal metadata indicated the transmission occurred approximately 3 hours after takeoff, long after the official ghost flight theory claimed everyone should have been unconscious or dead. This timeline was critical because it proved that the depressurization scenario, which formed the foundation of the accident explanation, could not account for someone having the awareness and capability to operate a device and attempt communication. Intelligence agencies involved in the analysis immediately classified much of this information, releasing only vague acknowledgments that new data had been found. The reason for this secrecy became clear when analysts examined the final piece of information contained in the signal, coordinates that pointed to a location no one had searched. Those coordinates would reveal why the plane had never been found, and why certain governments may have preferred it stayed hidden in the depths. The plane was taken. The GPS coordinates embedded in the decoded transmission pointed to a location in the Indian Ocean that had never appeared in any official search zone despite years of effort and hundreds of millions of dollars spent combing the sea floor. This location sat within a restricted military zone, an area designated for naval sonar testing and submarine operations, where civilian vessels are prohibited from entering and where even military access is tightly controlled. The coordinates placed the aircraft approximately 200 nautical miles from the nearest edge of the official search area, in waters that reach depths of 4,000 meters in some sections. More importantly, this location coincided with an underwater geography that included deep trenches and complex terrain, ideal for concealing large objects from standard search equipment like side-scan sonar and autonomous underwater vehicles. When researchers cross-referenced the coordinates with maritime navigation charts and military exclusion zones, they discovered that this area had been designated as restricted for several decades, officially for weapons testing and naval exercises. Access requires specific authorization from defense departments and civilian ships that stray into these waters are intercepted and redirected by patrol vessels. This level of security meant that even if debris or wreckage existed there, discovery would be unlikely. What made this location even more suspicious was the lack of inclusion in the original search plan. The mathematical analysis of satellite data had produced a probability zone where the aircraft most likely ended up. But this restricted area, despite falling within a reasonable margin of error, was apparently never investigated. Search coordinators focused efforts on international waters where operations could proceed without diplomatic complications. In 2023, 2 years before the AI discovery, a private search vessel equipped with advanced deep-sea scanning technology had approached the edge of this restricted zone while conducting an independent search funded by families of the victims. According to crew accounts, the vessel was contacted by military authorities and instructed to change course immediately. When the search team requested permission to scan the area, citing humanitarian reasons, they were denied. The official explanation for this denial cited safety concerns and active military operations, standard responses for restricted zones. But the timing raised questions, as there were no publicly announced exercises in that area during that period. The search vessel's data showed unusual sonar returns at the very edge of the restricted zone before they were forced to turn back, readings consistent with large metallic objects. The combination of deliberate systems shutdown, controlled flight path, practiced route, conscious passenger transmission, and coordinates pointing to a militarily protected zone created a picture that was impossible to reconcile with accident. Not an accident. Not a mystery. The accumulated evidence forms a narrative that diverges completely from the ghost flight story the world was asked to accept. Each piece of data, examined individually, might allow for alternative explanations, but together they create a pattern that points unmistakably toward intentional human action, careful planning, and a final destination chosen for its ability to hide evidence permanently from civilian discovery. The sequential shutdown of communication systems demonstrates someone in the cockpit working methodically to isolate the aircraft from tracking, the kind of procedure that requires knowledge, access, and deliberate intent. The flight path threading between radar coverage zones and following navigational waypoints shows skilled piloting with specific goals, not the wandering of an unpiloted aircraft. The simulator data proves someone had practiced this exact route, planning and visualizing the journey weeks before execution. The passenger transmission breaks the ghost flight theory entirely by providing proof that at least one person remained conscious and aware hours into the flight, understanding that something catastrophic was happening and attempting to document it. The controlled breathing, the coherent message, the technical capability to send the signal, all indicate rational thought and purposeful action, even as the aircraft flew toward its end. The GPS coordinates pointing to a militarily restricted zone suggest the final destination was not random fuel exhaustion over empty ocean, but a carefully selected location where the aircraft would sink into depths and terrain that make recovery nearly impossible, protected by security protocols that prevent civilian search efforts. This choice of endpoint requires geographical knowledge and possibly coordination, or at minimum awareness of areas that would remain unsearched. Whether this was the action of a pilot, a passenger, multiple individuals working together, or involvement by external parties remains officially unanswered. What can no longer be credibly maintained is that Flight 370 suffered a mechanical failure and flew itself to a random crash site. The aircraft was flown, its systems were deliberately managed, passengers were somehow incapacitated while at least one remained conscious. The reluctance of authorities to fully investigate certain angles, the classification of evidence, The dismissal of the passenger with specialized background and the denial of access to search the restricted zone all suggest that the complete truth involves information that governments have decided the public should not know. Whether this involves intelligence operations, technology theft, geopolitical conflicts, or other classified matters, the pattern of official behavior indicates knowledge being withheld. The families of Flight 370 still gather every March 8th, holding candles and demanding answers that may never come. The official investigation remains closed. The zone where the coordinates point stays off-limits, guarded by patrol boats and military authority. Meanwhile, the decoded passenger message sits in intelligence databases, acknowledged but never fully released to the public. MH370 did not disappear into mystery. It was placed deliberately where the ocean's depth and military restrictions would keep it hidden, perhaps forever. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.